It's a real pleasure and an honor to host three of the premier storytellers in science journalism. For what I hope will be a fun and useful discussion about nonfiction science storytelling. This audience consists largely, of course, of science journalists, and we're all storytellers in our own ways, but we can really only aspire to do it as well as these three do. So thank you very much for coming. I'll give brief introductions for our three guests, our three eminent guests. It seems silly to introduce Rebecca Skloot to an audience of science journalists, but her book, here it is. I don't even need to say its name. It's like Clarence Clemens in that way. It's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Do I need to say his name? It's an absolute publishing phenomenon. And it's really got to be the most popular serious science book in recent memory. It was released in 2010, and it's been a fixture on the New York Times bestseller list ever since, either in hardback or the paperback list. And she's now working on a book about human-animal bonds. She lived in New York until a few years ago, and she worked as a writer and editor for various science magazines, and also did work for JAD at Radiolab, and also for Nova Science Now. And here's a little known fact about Becca. She was a teacher here at SHERP in 2007 when the 25s were here. The 25s rocking the house? Yeah, there are some, yeah. All right, there's a couple. So welcome, Rebecca. Next to Rebecca is Mary Roach. Bert Bilger of the New Yorker, who also was a former SHERP faculty member, described Mary as the funniest science writer in the country. It's pretty high praise. The funniest intentional, let's say the intentionally funniest science writer. Yeah, she means it, and she's quite good at it. But she's not just a humorist. She's also a wonderful narrator and an explainer, and she's a crackerjack historian too, although she'll deny that. She also started out writing for magazines and newspapers, and she was really good at it. But of course, what she's famous for are her books. She's written 4 of them. Stiff, her breakthrough book, was about cadavers. Spook was about science and the afterlife. Bonk was about sex. I keep wanting to call it boink, but it's actually bonk. Could I just say?
I made up little peel and stick letter I's for people like
yes.
you. You go ahead, you put that on, you call it boink.
It really should have been boink. If I was your editor, I would have insisted on that.
Boink.
And her most recent book is Packing for Mars, which many people in the room have read, about science in the void of space. And she's working, all these books are absolutely hilarious, and they're illuminating, but painlessly illuminating. And watch out, because she's finishing a 5th. It's called Gulp, A Trip Down the Alimentary Canal. So it's going to be suitably gross, and we're all excited. We're all excited to meet to get acquainted with our own insides. And then our third speaker guest is Jabu Murad, who is the very big brain behind Radiolab, which is, of course, the phenomenally successful radio show produced at WNYC and broadcast around the country and podcasts around the world. He started Radiolab and co-hosts it with Robert Krulwich, another friend of SHERP. Jad trained as a musician and a composer, and he brings that same sense of meticulous composition to his radio work, but somehow it sounds effortless when he does it, despite what's got to be an incredibly laborious process to get there. He started out freelancing for NPR and Studio 360. Then in 2004, he started experimenting with Krulwich on a program they called Radiolab. They had their first full season of shows in 2005, and It won critical acclaim and, more shockingly, a lot of listeners, a shocking amount of listeners. Many of those people hear it via podcasts, and they're passionate aficionados of the show, including many people in this room. In 2011, Jad won the ultimate accolade for a creative person. He won a MacArthur Fellowship, in other words, a Genius Grant. The foundation cited his, quote, engaging audio explorations of scientific and philosophical questions, which bring a, quote, distinctive new aesthetic to broadcast journalism. What they mean is that he's an awesome storyteller. And he's often compared to a conductor. He orchestrates dialogue, music, and sound effects into compelling documentaries that draw listeners into investigations of otherwise intimidating subjects. So let's get started. I'll take the moderator's privilege of asking the first question. And though I promise that this will be a fun night, I feel like we probably should start with a question that's not that much fun. And that is to address the elephant in the room, which is that it's actually been a kind of a choppy year for science storytelling. We've had some high-profile falls from grace, some embarrassments. But on the plus side, I think we've also shown that the community, the science journalism community, is capable of self-correction as well as useful reflection. A lot of that reflection is centered on the tension between being grounded in scientific fact, acknowledging uncertainty and alternative explanations. That's the messiness of science, as Carl Zimmer and others have put it. Carl's here somewhere. There he is, well, somewhere. While doing all that, while simultaneously being fascinating, compelling, novel, emotive, understandable, all those things that bring acclaim and income, it's really hard to do both. So I guess what I'd like to do is begin by asking each of you to tell us about how you deal with those collisions in your own work, and how frequently do they come up? What do you do about them? And give us some examples, too. Rebecca, you want to start?
Sure. Which collisions?
We didn't say this would be easy. Between fact-based, the fact that science storytelling is inevitably grounded in evidence, and that evidence is often murky and sometimes contradictory. It doesn't always lend itself to nice, clean narrative. And there's kind of a collision there between communicating the reality of the messiness of the scientific process while also wanting to deliver beautiful, clean narrative storytelling. It's not so easy to do both.
I guess that to me is all part of the stories of science. And I think I do very different kind of science writing, I think, than some of the people who are dealing with that conflict on I have a deadline and I have 800 words to 1,000, 1,500 words to deal with this really complicated science thing where I need to, this happened, this is what we found, but there's all these qualifiers, and I don't, I have more space, I have more time, and to me those places where science is unclear just becomes part of the story, and I include the lack of clarity as much as I can in the stories. Because that's just part of the scientific process. We learn things and then we change, and there are a lot of people who've written about that. So I guess in terms of the murkiness of the scientific process, I have the fortunate, I think, sort of the luck. I'm lucky to have time on my side to work through things in a longer form than I think the people who do it for newspapers, who wrestle with that in a really different way.
Do you ever find yourself having to sort of chop out the detail, chop out the explanation, chop out the subtlety in order to just keep the story moving?
No, I don't, because I think it's so important that the science be accurate. And I think when you chop out, of course, there's a certain degree of subtlety that you can't do for the general public in some ways. This is why scientists are not always very good at writing for the public, because scientists, the whole nature of science is to qualify things, because nothing is ever certain. And you can't do that and keep the public's not even just engaged, but understanding entirely what you're talking about. So the way I deal with that is I try to boil it down as much as I can, and I have target readers that I use to help me kind of, with a lot of the science that I did in this book, I had this range of audiences in mind, in my head, people who I wanted to be able to read the book. I wanted, on one spectrum, someone who didn't even have a high school diploma, had no interest in science whatsoever, to be able to read the book and follow the science and learn from it. But I also wanted, a Nobel Prize winning scientist to be able to read it and not think that I had oversimplified to the point that it was inaccurate. And I wanted everybody in between to be able to read it, which is sort of a ridiculous target, in some ways. But I think that's our job as writers, and I think as science writers, we do need to write to everyone in order to, part of what we do is communicating science to a public that is largely illiterate about science. And so I had in my head certain people that I know who fit each of those groups, and I would, write a section of the book, and then I would print it out and I would send it to them. And on, the I don't care about science, I'm sort of terrified of science side of that spectrum, I would get feedback that was like, I skipped this, for like a whole page, I skipped that. And then, on the science side, I would get scientists saying, they would maybe point out like, okay, well this you've oversimplified, and so then I would gather all of these comments back from the whole spectrum and say, okay, how do I make this person not skip that? How do I make him think, this person over here think I didn't oversimplify while keeping all these people in the middle? And so then I would rewrite, and then I would send it out to a new batch of readers that were in the same category. So, this is part of why it took me 11 years to write the book. But I think that's the job, and I think on shorter, on a smaller scale, you can do that. And also, but I think just thinking of those people as I wrote was helpful to try and maintain the accuracy of all of it.
Mary, you want to take a shot at that?
I think I'm at a tremendous advantage in that I have no background in science.
None of us do, really.
No, I don't. I think that I'm automatically I'm kind of at the level of my reader, so I have kind of an intuitive sense of this is too complicated and everybody's going to be bored because I'm kind of getting bored with it. And then when I'm leaving too much out and oversimplifying, one thing that helps me a lot is that I'm usually focusing on when you've got narrative and story and character involved in the telling of science, you're looking at a person and the work that they do, and when you're profiling someone and their work, it's a little easier than sort of trying to be speaking to the entire issue, all of the issues, everybody's opinions. When I used to do more magazine-based work, one of the things that was really hard was you'd call one person and you'd call somebody else who said, "Oh, that's ridiculous," and inevitably it was like doing an opinion poll rather than doing research. And I would kind of have to find my spirit guide, somebody who I felt had been involved with the science long enough to know both sides, to be honest, and to kind of take me through it and say, okay, here's these issues and here's those. And so I could not drag people through an endless, there's this, but there's also that, and there's the person, and then the study in 1967, and then there's, because no one wants to go through that. So you have to go through it beforehand, process it all, and somehow state it in a way that's accurate but not tedious. And I don't know that these people were the right people to grab onto, but I'd sort of find someone who I trusted to be able to lead me through the morass of all the contradictory studies and things that, when I am tackling something that is that complex.
Jeff?
What was the question again? It was how do you balance
well, we sort of shifted a little bit, but yeah, it's really about this tension between the story. You want to keep things simple. Relatively simple. You want there to be nice narrative pacing. You want there to be a twist somewhere. You want there to be compelling characters and a clean story. And sometimes science doesn't exactly give you that. Okay. And so what do you do in those circumstances?
Well, to a certain degree, maybe Rebecca said this at the beginning of her answer, but to a certain degree, those tensions are implicit in the scientific process itself. You have a hypothesis, you have something that you believe to be true, the way that you imagine the world works, and then you have the evidence, and you have to somehow manage the two. And initially, I found that to be a hard thing, especially when you're trying to sort of do explainer pieces where you're distilling science and using metaphor and analogies, which generally scientists don't like. But I actually I sort of feel like that tension is the game in some sense. And it's about not resolving that tension. It's about somehow holding the tension. That you're trying to do both, and they're not quite binary. If you're going to tell a good story, it's not necessarily at the expense of the science. And if you're going to do a scientifically accurate thing, it's not necessarily at the expense of the story. They somehow can both coexist. And so I guess I kind of see my job at these days as tuning the tension between those two things, which is a very iterative thing. And so there's no way I've found to get it right the first time. So it's a little bit like what Rebecca was saying. You do something, you go back to the scientist and you say, look, we're going to talk about genetics, but we're going to have this, we're going to make it theatrical, and we're going to have, for genes, we're going to have the Shakespearean actor doing this and a little 4-year-old girl doing this. Anthropomorphizing for sure, but are you okay with that? And they'll say, well, I am, but you need to change this word always to sometimes. You need to change this to so-and-so, and they help you get there. And then you go and you play it for your wife, you know, and she says, I don't really understand. So then you make some changes, you take it back to the science, and so you kind of oscillate between these two polarities and hopefully get to a place where you don't feel like you're choosing. I feel like it's a trap to feel like it's a choice. I really do. I feel like to see it as like one necessarily operates at the expense of the other leads you to either dumb down what you're doing or to do something that's so accurate that it puts your audience into a coma. So I feel like that, like both of those two are a trap.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, these things can absolutely exist together. One thing that I often find is, especially when you deal with any kind of narrative writing, is that, you know, people often assume that when you start dealing with narrative that you're making things up. Just, you know, whether it's just little details like, you know, the weather, what somebody was wearing, or, you know, or a narrative arc, that you're somehow shaping it because you want the narrative to be a certain way. And
Right.
you know, there are certainly people who do that, and I am not. I think that that's a very bad thing. You know, and there are ways to do narrative writing that are also completely factually accurate. They takes a long time, and you have to look for details that reporters we don't tend to look for, and people don't think we want. Like when I'm doing, you know, some of the research for this, you know, some narrative stuff, you know, I'll be interviewing somebody and be like, and why do you care what color my shoes were?
Yeah.
Like I'm, you know, this scientist doing this thing, and you know, so some of it is for me, is finding the balance between the science and the narrative means really thinking about them independently as I'm doing my interviewing and as I'm doing my research. So I look for the science, and I do the science reporting very intensely, and then I also do the narrative reporting, and I do it just as intensely, and I fact check all of it. And you know, usually the narrative part starts with somebody just telling you a story. You know, somebody who remembered something. And like the first scene in my book, you know, took place in the 50s, so I obviously wasn't there. And like, it's, you know, guy drives up to the hospital, it's raining, he parks under this certain tree, you know, she walks into the hospital, it looks a certain way. And that started by getting, you know, just with a nugget of a story from someone who, you know, the guy who was driving the car. But then you can do actual research to verify the stuff that's going on. Like, you get an archival photo of the outside of Hopkins at 1950. Was there a tree there? Yes. Take it to a botanist. Is that an oak? Yes, that was an oak. And then you can, you know, picture the car, and then the weather report. You can show, yep, it was raining. And, you know, and that's the level of reporting that we would sort of do with the narrative details of it. And then you kind of have to, you know, to me, there's not much difference between science in some ways and reporting and the kind of work we do. It's all about following your curiosity, following the facts wherever they're leading you. So you
Right.
I never think of shaping a narrative. I'm just following the story wherever it's taking me. And then at a certain point, I have to say, okay, now I'm going to map it out and see what happened and look and see, is there a story there? Is there an arc? Or do I have to, you know, and like, how do I put that together in a way that is accurate and still narratively fun to read?
I also feel, though, that there has to be a place where you can speculate. You can be like, I don't really know that this is the truth, but this is what I think, this is the conclusions I think we can draw. This is where I think we can go with this information. And, you know, if you do that with a certain amount of humility, and you say, I don't really know the answer to this, but this is what it might lead to, I feel like that's what people are wanting. They're wanting to somehow be able to put the information and the stories in a larger context. And that larger context is not always clear. It's actually probably never clear. But there should be a way in which we as journalists allow ourselves to kind of indulge in conjecture. As long as we're very clear with our audience,
Right,
that's
that's
what
what I
I'm
was
doing.
going to say.
That's the total
With
secret.
blinking red
Yeah.
lights all around the
But you have to
Yeah.
be absolutely transparent, and I think a lot of young reporters in particular just don't feel comfortable with that.
Yeah.
They're like, well, we don't know this, and so I'm just going to leave it out.
Right.
When really the best approach is just to be clear with your readers
And I think
about
people
what you know and what you don't
I think
know.
that people respond to that as well. If you say, you know, if you let someone have their say, and then you come in and say, and I don't know what the answer is.
Right.
This sounds plausible to me, but then again, but I don't know.
Mhm.
Right.
I don't know. It's okay to say I don't know, because your reader's probably saying I don't know too. And
Yeah.
I think that makes them, I think that it establishes trust in a way.
But what that necessitates is the I pronoun in a way. I mean, you are actually, there's an active confession, I think, in a lot of science journalism, because you very quickly get to the border between what you can say scientifically is accurate and what the mystery that's right on the other side. And it's that place where I feel like you as reporters have to just sort of confess your own beliefs, and do it in a way that's absolutely, again, transparent. You're not pretending to know more than you do, but I mean, that's what we do all the time on Radio
Right, I was
Lab.
going to say, that's like sort of what Radiolab is
Yeah,
all
I mean,
about.
it's, okay, this is
Yeah.
you sort of take a very rigorous walk to the edge, and then you stare out at the rest of it.
And I actually think a lot of the people who've gotten in trouble were people who profess certainty about things that are very much uncertain.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it
Absolutely.
can be a power trip. I mean, you especially when you're writing a book and there is no fact checker like there is at a magazine. You say what you want, and here you are, the author, and people are going to believe what you say. And I think you just have to be very careful with that power.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. All three of you either freelanced or wrote. You were working stiffs before you became who you are. And when you're a working stiff, you're writing for an editor, and the editor is very concerned about the demographics of the publication and the reader, and so as a young reporter, you sort of get pounded into you. Think about your reader all the time. Don't just follow your own passions, which is a very deflating thing to say to a student. Don't exclusively follow your own passions. You need to also think about the marketplace. You need to think about serving your reader. But at another level, for the three of you who are, essentially doing what you want and sort of following your own creative impulses, at this point, are you still thinking about your audience? I mean, I know a lot of people, very creative people, who will say, I don't really care what the readers think. I write what I care about. I write what entertains me, and the audience can go to hell. But I wonder how much of that is just big talk, and because they've already sort of internalized what an audience wants. So maybe you can each take that on.
I guess I would start, I want to, this like maybe kind of ties to these things. You mentioned the fact checking, that books don't have fact checkers. And I think that's a big issue. I actually hired multiple fact checkers to work with me on my book because I think in part I started in that world of writing for magazines and having editors, and nothing I ever published went out without being intensely fact checked by a lot of people who were not sort of personally invested on my side, sort of me in the story in the way that I was. And the idea of just writing a book and putting it out there with just me as the fact checker for it was terrifying to
Scary.
me. Absolutely terrifying. And I think that there is, blogs don't have fact checkers, books, unless you personally hire them yourself, which a lot of us, it's really hard to do. You're really on your own in a way that I think some people get lost with. And I think that, I think that's some of what we see in some of these big cases is these were, sure, some people were fact-checked and then also were kind of screwing with the facts. But a lot of times what you see are people who were just sort of on their own. And, book editors they don't have the time to edit like magazine editors. They're not doing what editors at magazines tend to do, but really in there. And, I think a lot of when you're writing for both blogs and books, you're on your own in a way that you really have to be aware of. I think that and sometimes you have to reach out for the kind of help to keep yourself, make sure you're being as accurate as you think you are. So I think that's part of it.
But who are you writing for when you're writing
Right.
your
So I
book?
was just going to get to that. So I had I think I would be interested to hear what Mary and Jad have to say about this too. Like before I published my book and it became what it became. I wrote for magazines and things, and people kind of knew me, sort of, but there was no expectation about what I was going to do, what I was going to write, and now, obviously it's very different. There's this, what's she going to do next, and, how do you follow a book like that, and that can be really difficult.
I want to ask you about that too. Yeah.
And so I try very, very hard to not think about my readers because of that. Right now, anyways, I'm trying to not think about them because I can't think about the expectations. Otherwise, it can be sort of crippling, I think. And, so for me, I do I kind of disagree in a sense with, like, I mean, I think we agree and disagree about, when we were talking about freelancing and that you can't always follow your passions. I actually think part of the job of a journalist is to be able to figure out how to follow your curiosity and your passion within every story, even if it's something that somebody just assigned to you and you didn't care about it on the front end. To be able to kind of harness that following your curiosity through a story, I mean, that's, I think, where we find the most interesting facts. And, so I think I try to just keep that inside of me of thinking about, I'm following my curiosity. That's what I did the first time. It was something I was curious about and passionate about, and that's what helped me find the story. And so I try to keep that in mind as much as I can.
So you're not really consciously thinking about your reader at all?
Well, I am in the way that I sort of mentioned earlier, that I have these target readers in my head that are for clarity and for the people who I am sort of wanting to reach. But yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, when you're writing a book, like, your audience is everybody. Especially with science writing, I think it's really important to try to get your book out as broadly as you can for science literacy and everything else. So yeah, I have very specific readers in my mind, but I don't think, like, I'm writing for the audience of, Discover, and, like, that's it.
I do have a very specific audience in mind, but it's kind of like that scene in Being John Malkovich where the whole restaurant is all like John Malkovich. So I'm kind of, I do feel that there's this wonderful subset of the population that thinks just like me and gets excited about the same weird shit. And those are my people, and I know they're out there. I can't necessarily always see them, but because I can't, and when I wrote Stiff, I mean, there was some discussion with my publisher. What is the demographic? Is it male? Is it female? Are they young? Are they old?
Dead people, of course.
Yes, dead people. And dead people never buy books. So,
that is a problem.
So they did a cover that didn't appeal specifically to any particular demographic. It's just like, let's throw this out there and go like this. I don't know who's going to read it. So it's those Mary Roach people. So I write for those Mary Roach people, whatever they are. So that's all I know how to do. I mean, and it is very different than writing for magazines, where you do have in your head, I got to please the editor's got to worry about the demographics and the advertisers and the top edit, and there's just a lot of stuff that I know, it might be yanked for political reasons or ad sales reasons or whatever it is. So it's very liberating to move to books where that isn't in your head all the time. When I'm writing my books, there's very few people in my head. When I wrote Bonk, my stepdaughters were definitely in my head, sort of
as censors.
As censors. As people going, ew.
Jen, who are you thinking about when you're working?
I don't know. See, it's funny. When I was thinking about listening to you guys answer the question, I was thinking about this situation, the very ordinary situation in making a show, where you're in the studio by yourself, and it's you and this mic, and you're trying to talk to somebody, and you don't quite know who you're talking to. But what ends up happening is you speak something into the mic and into the computer, and then it plays back 5 seconds later, and you hear it. And in some sense, I agree that, like, I don't imagine the audience, because to do that would be too terrifying. Suddenly you get into all the shoulds. I should do this, should do that, and then that takes you out of your own voice. But at the same time, you're there in the studio listening to yourself, and it's not exactly you who is talking back to you. So in some sense, you are having a conversation with yourself from 5 seconds ago. So there is some way in which it is like simultaneously a conversation that involves one person. But there is an imagined audience out there. But it is, I think, maybe like an audience of Mary Roaches in a way. It's people who you just trust are interested in the same things that you're interested in, are searching for meaning in the same way that you're searching. And somehow, when the voice comes back and it talks to you, I just trust that it's going to talk to somebody else. But to imagine that person and think of them demographically, it would never work. It would never work, particularly
Also,
in what we do. It's
oddly enough, I find there are things that I will say in a book to this possibly vast, well, not vast would be the wrong, vast is your audience. But
Hey,
this
your
large
audience is
group-
pretty
this
vast.
large group of people, there's things I will say to them, because I'm sitting in a room by myself, and I will be very honest and sometimes blushingly so. There are things I will say to this mass of anonymous readers that I wouldn't necessarily sit down and say to a friend, which is kind of a strange phenomenon.
Yeah, so in your case, it might be sort of inhibiting to
Yeah,
think too much about
it's best
an
that
audience.
I don't even think that there's any audience ever out there.
Yeah.
Wait, I lost the thread there. Are you saying, were you to think about the audience, you would say more about yourself than you're
Less.
comfortable?
No, I would say less if
I
I
would
were
say
to think
less,
about
okay.
the audience. So I'm in a room by myself, and I don't have
Yeah.
in my head an audience.
Ah.
So it can be very stupidly confessional,
If
because
you're
it
gonna-
is going to go out there, and people
Oh, I
go,
see, I see.
you know.
If you're going to undress yourself, emotionally at least, you'd really rather do it without thinking too much about
Right.
all the other
Who's
people who are
watching.
looking.
Yeah.
But if you're going to undress on some level, you know they're out there. You're not just, you know what I'm saying? Like
like being in an apartment in New
paradoxical, is all I'm
York.
saying.
Like-
You don't speak and do this stuff for your own masturbatory enjoyment.
Right.
You know there are people out there.
Speak for
It's-
yourself.
Right.
Right.
As you hope.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I could ask questions all night, but feel free to plunge in if you've got them. Yeah. Oh, Nick, you got one?
Yeah.
All right. Here comes Rachel with the microphone.
Hi, I am Nick Stockton. I'm a 31. I probably should ask this question like 18 minutes ago, but
By the way, that means he's in school right now.
I'm in school right now.
30,
at this moment.
what's-
31st class.
31st class
It's
of
part of our
the
little secret code.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So you guys were talking about making a speculatory claim at the end of your articles, your shows, your books, and saying this is the evidence and this is what I believe about this evidence. How do you assure your reader or your listener that when you're presenting that evidence, you're not doing it in a way that kind of fits your narrative into the way that you believe, the way you interpret that evidence? You know, not in the way you're making those like overarching claims of complete confidence, like that people got in trouble for, but you're making this like, you still have an authority, even though you're not making like an absolute claim. You're saying like, this is what I believe. People are like, they believe that, so I kind of think that too. How do you
Yeah.
on the back end say like, this is the way I've researched this, and I've looked at it as a spectrum, and this is how I came to this.
Right. I think we all probably do it very differently because we all do such different use of that. I don't speculate in that way at all. There are a few things in my book where the science is included. I won't speculate and be like, this is what I think may have happened. I will, when scientists are speculating, like if there's something that isn't known or isn't clear, I'll include that. And if there's something where I don't know exactly what happened, like there are a couple situations in my book. One is like George Guy, the scientist who took these cells from Henrietta Lacks. There's one person who claimed that he went to her bedside before she died and said, your cells are alive and they're going to make you immortal. And everyone else said he never talked to her, he never met her, he didn't even know she was like a black woman, he knew nothing about her. And so that's like a big moment in the story, and I could never find anybody else who said he went to this bed. And this woman was like, he told me, I was like in there, and I know. So I just put that in there. This woman said this, everybody else said that. It would fit with his personality based on everything. Like everybody agrees that would maybe be something he would do. You decide. And so whenever I have something where there's lack of clarity, I make it clear that it's not me who's speculating. I say, this is the person who's speculating. This is what everybody else thinks. You figure it out. And that's the same with, like, why are her cells alive? We don't really know. There are all these theories. Here they are. And then I kind of let people decide which ones they think are the most convincing. So you wouldn't, but that's what you do in Radiolab is very different in that way, because part of the show is this kind of fantastical, trying to stretch your mind and have you think about science in different ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think of it akin as to like you're falling in love with somebody, and there's a moment right before you just tip over the event horizon and fall completely head over heels in love. There's a moment where you check yourself and you're like, okay, should I really fall in love with this? Like, Rebecca, what do you think? Should I fall in love? And then she said, well, I don't know, maybe, think about this. You're like, oh, right, of course. So it's like you have to surround yourself with, so in some, I mean, I hope that makes a little bit of sense what I just said. But in some way, it's like you fall in love with your own version of things. And the only way to prove to the reader that your version is valuable is if you check yourself at a certain point in front of them. And not my opinion, because we do broadcast. We say, this is amazing. This is how I want the world to be. But before I fully buy into that, let me just hear from the people who disagree. So drag the critics into the room and see if they can beat you, and if you can beat them, with an open heart. And I think that you can still have your version of things, but you just need to make sure you want to fall in love with it.
Hi, my name is Eric Simmering. I married a SHERP 24. I don't know what that's worth. My question is, I think that only a handful of people, namely scientists themselves, understand science via science education. Many more know about science because of what you write or broadcast. And we make our decisions based on what we understand or what most of us understand from you. And so my question is, do you understand your job not just as journalists, but as really at the forefront of people who shape and change the direction of scientific research? I mean, the most obvious example is people will get grants based on how popular it is. And many examples, but it extends a bit beyond, it seems to me, just reporting.
Yeah. We could even expand that question a little bit and say, you know, what are we really doing here? Are we here to tell stories? Are we here to support or steer science, which is what Eric is suggesting? Are we here to educate? Are we here to inform? Are we here just to relate things that we think are cool? And since they're cool to us, we want to tell you about it. Why are we here?
That question has Mary Roach written all over it.
I feel a very specific mission, if I have any mission, is to, my ideal audience is people who don't think they're interested in science. And if I hear from somebody who read the book, and frequently I thought this was going to be really, really boring. But it wasn't. I mean, that to me...
yeah, big win.
Yeah, big win.
Me too.
So I'm just about keeping science out there, alive. I want people, I just want, the word, to me, when people say, I find science is kind of boring, I don't really like science. This just kills me. I mean, science is, it's you, it's your leg, it's your dog, it's your computer, it's the weather, it's the fucking world, man, come on. How can you say it's boring? That kills me.
And
So,
the process itself is all about solving mysteries.
yeah, aren't you? Where's your
It's
curiosity?
the most
don't
basic
you?
narrative there is.
So but I know there are tons of people out there who don't feel that way about science. So I'm just trying to win over, people's like, whoa, I thought this was, that's kind of interesting. So, but I do, I very much agree. I mean, there is a tremendous burden to get things right. I mean, there's just so, if you present the findings of a study and you don't make clear, how is the scientist funded, or does he have another agenda? How big was the subject pool? What kind of, how important are these results, and where are we in the clinical trials? Don't just say, there's an exciting new cure. Let's put this in context and give some detail. And I mean, I'm not doing that kind of reporting so much, but it's so important.
I could talk endlessly about this, and I won't. I will try not to. But I think that part of the reason why people think science is so boring is because it tends to be presented in a very boring way. And I think that one of our jobs is to get those people who think that science is boring to understand how it's not, and to read through our stories and to learn about science. And this book is at its core largely about a total breakdown of science communication. It's about scientific illiteracy. It's about a family who didn't have access to basic education and the really horrible sort of things that happened as a result of that. And so a lot of what I write about, a lot of what I talk about is science literacy and the role that the media plays in it for good and for bad. I think that badly done science journalism or quickly done science journalism is horribly dangerous because people make health decisions based on that. People will or won't go to the doctors. Project will or won't get funded. I mean, you like it or not, we have a lot of power with the general public and with scientists and everyone else. And this is one of the reasons, this book came out 3.5 years ago, and I am still on the road talking about it constantly, largely because I'm talking to audiences, both in the general public, sort of kind of trying to help with the building of science literacy in those groups, but then also going and talking to policymakers about, okay, how do you respond to this? They're writing laws based on some of this stuff now. And you can't just put it out there and be like, okay, here's the story, here's everything that happens, discuss, and then be like, see ya. What happens is what happens. So I feel like this is part of my job, is to very much be involved in making sure that the story I put out is accurate, that it encourages scientific literacy and accuracy, sort of an understanding, but then that it's also, in a case like this, understood correctly, not then taken and twisted in a way and used like to pass bad policies. So, but obviously I worked on this for a long time, so you don't do that with every story you write, but I do think it's important. And I also now tend to spend a lot of time speaking at high schools, middle schools, because one of the things I realized as I was traveling talking about the book is that storytelling, we are storytelling people, since, cave painting, and we learn through stories. And one of the things I see with young people in particular is the story gets them into science in a way that they haven't been, I think, sometimes before. And so I feel a great sense of responsibility in terms of getting kids interested in science, and particularly young women, into potentially following that curiosity. So yeah, so this has taken on the responsibility that I feel with science writing has grown for me more and more over time.
But how much of that is a product of the success of the book, and how much of it did you intend from the very beginning? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, why did you do this to begin with?
Yeah.
What was your purpose?
It was just this, there was, in some sense, it was just like, I have to tell this story. This is a crazy story. Like, I was obsessed with this story, but also that I felt like it's an important story that has the potential to teach us so much about so many different things that are relevant today, whether it's healthcare, access to education. I mean, there were so many big issues that I did feel like were important to be part of the public conversation that weren't. So yeah, absolutely, I was trying to get a conversation started. I didn't have an agenda in terms of what I wanted people to decide based on that. And that's why I very much wanted to sort of present all the evidence and let people make their own decisions. I don't think my job is to tell people what to think. I think it's to get people thinking and try to at least hopefully make it so that what they're thinking about is based on accurate information. So yeah, I think I've always felt like that. But I have a science background, so my undergraduate was in science. I worked for many years in research labs and hospitals, and I came to science writing as a scientist who was very interested in the intersection of science and daily life. So I knew a lot about scientific illiteracy when I started as a writer, and I think that's part of what made me get into writing in the first place. So I'm probably slightly different in that sense.
How about you, Jen?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Wake up.
Sorry, I was just so into what you
I
said.
know.
We've covered something about
we've covered a lot of ground.
responsibility
We're really
towards-
talking about motivation and responsibility. Sort of.
specifically towards
Yeah,
science.
well, towards science, but I sort of broaden that out to sort of say, what are we doing here? Are we just telling stories because they're good stories, or are we telling stories for some broader purpose? Whether it is to steer science in a better direction than it's going, or to shine a light on something that's, needs more attention, or is it more elemental than that? And this is a story that fascinated me, so I think I'd like to tell you because I think it'll fascinate you.
Yeah, I see it as sort of more elemental. I mean, it's hard for me to sort of conceptualize at least what I'm doing as having any value to the scientific enterprise broadly. I mean, perhaps it does, perhaps it doesn't, I don't know. I mean, insofar as we try to embody the scientific method, we try and, I don't see science as a geography that you need to treat, and it's not simply people in lab coats, it's, it's a way of asking questions, and so we try and own that and be that. But for me, it has something to do, I mean, I don't have a background in science, but my parents were scientists. And my earliest memories with my mother were listening to her try, for the 20th time, describe to me what this little protein that she studies actually does. It's a little protein that takes fat and it gets it into the cell. And for a long time, it was thought that fat just kind of through osmosis got through the cell wall, but it turns out it needs a little canoe to canoe it across the border. And so she would, she'd be there at the table with a napkin and a salt shaker and a fork, and she'd say, here's the border, and like, here's how it gets across the border. They thought it just kind of sunk its way through, but really it needs to. And so I would kind of look at her, head cocked sideways. And so my earliest emotional attachments to science are watching her so desperately try to make me understand. And so for me, there's something about that which I feel like it's very primal. It's about storytelling, it's about the campfire experience, but it's also about we're on this planet for a flicker, like a tiny moment, and then we're gone. And in this moment, there's an urgency to understand everything about how this world works. why are we here? Why do things work this way and not that way? To me, it's a desperate attempt to understand the sort of context through the sort of amniotic fluid through which you swim, and then you're gone. So it has nothing to do with the scientific enterprise as a whole. For me, it's something more basic. It's about a kind of just deep curiosity, that holds you in place.
I have a question.
Oh, okay, yeah. Go ahead, Olivia.
Olivia.
Make sure the green.
Oh, I think
light's
they
on.
have.
Over
there was
here.
I think maybe
I don't know who has the microphone first.
Oh,
You have one,
okay.
and then you have one, yeah.
All right, I'm sorry. You start, Olivia.
She was-
just
she
hold
was
on
very
one second. Go ahead.
Rosie Foster, SHERP 7. This is a question directed to Rebecca, but by extension, also the other panelists could comment. I met you in 2005 at an NSW meeting when you were probably, I don't know, neck deep in your book and talking about not showering for 3 days and trying to get things done. So when I read your book, I was so happy for you. So many congratulations for your success. But as I was reading your book, I found that as much as it was about science and public policy, what drove me to turn the page was the emotional aspect of this family story. And your part in this story of getting the story, I think, is what kept me going. And there were times I was scared for you when you were trying to find her family and all of this kind of thing. Was there ever a point in this process for you, which was obviously a very lengthy, intense process, that you wanted to bail out? And if there was, what kept you going? And maybe for the other panelists too, what happens when you get so deep in a story that you don't know if you can finish it? How do you keep going?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that kept me going. And one of them is I'm just really hard-headed. And my parents come to my events a lot, and this is one of the most frequently asked questions that I get, especially at schools. I mean, teachers and students are like, how do we keep people going through things? It's like, it really is this a big question. And part of me and my parents hear this question, they're like, the side of you that didn't give up on this thing and went into these crazy places was such a pain when you were a kid, because I was this impossible child that was kicked out of every school I went to, and I was just, because I was no, absolutely. At first school I was kicked out, it was in preschool, and it was just did not get better from there.
What did you do in preschool to get
What did I do?
kicked out?
I refused to nap. I was like, I'm not a napper. I've never been a napper. And they tried to make me nap, and I tried to explain to them that I didn't nap. And they locked me in a room, and I destroyed this bed with a paperclip. And then I got kicked out of second grade, fourth. I mean, it was just like on and on. And my grades went from C's to D's to F's. And and actually, the moment when I first learned about Henrietta cells, I was 16 in this basic biology class at a community college. And I was there because I'd failed biology at the local high school, and I had to make it up to graduate. And so there's some element of it is just like, this is just me. And that's sort of, and Deborah Lax was actually, in some ways, she's very similar. We as characters, could not be more different in some ways, except that. She was the most determined, hard-headed person, and also just inspiring in her absolutely unwavering determination to learn. She didn't have a basic education. She would carry a dictionary around with her and look up just words that she didn't understand in a conversation. You'd say something, she'd be like, wait. All right. That alone, that was inspiring. And but part of what she wanted was to learn about her mother. And so her determination to do that, she was one of my big inspirations along the way, but also one of my big hurdles. I mean, for those people who've read the book, it's crazy. Part of that story is her constantly pushing me away and then saying, no, okay, let's keep going, and at one point literally physically throwing me against a wall. And she had this ability to stop in the moment and stand back and say, okay, no, this is not about you. This is part of the story of what happened to me because of these cells. I can't trust anyone. And she would say, no matter what I do to you, don't let me stop you from writing this book. And she just said it over and over, and she said, and don't let anybody else stop you either. And so that sort of helped keep me going, and so did this. I had this incredible sense of responsibility to the story at a certain point, because I just believed it was so important to tell. And then the more I did my research, the more people died. There was, people who were in their 80s and 90s who I was interviewing, and they would, give me all of this information and share this history with me, and then a lot of them were dying as I was doing it. And so I felt this, wow, I have this whole story that I have to kind of do something with, and that kept me going too. And also, a lot of people in this room at various points kept me going, just talking about it. I would tell people the story. Michael Moyer is standing there. We worked at Popular Science together, and I was not just working on the book, but at that point my book contract had fallen apart completely. My publisher had gone out of business, and it got sucked somewhere else, and new editor tried to make me take the family out of the book and just write about the cells, and I got in this ridiculous battle with them, and and then I would go out for drinks with my friends after work and be like, ah, and and part of what would happen is I would just talk about the story, and like, this is what happened, and this is what happened, and I realized by talking about it with other people that they weren't sick of it. Like, yeah, I had been working on it all these years and I was losing my mind, but I would start telling the story and they would just go, like, what are you doing out of your house? Go home and write. Like, why? I want to read this, you need to do this, you need to go. And so people were constantly sort of behind me, pushing me forward when I got tired. And I know a lot of writers just won't talk about their projects as they're working on them with them, and I wonder if I would have ever finished if I didn't, because to me, in some element, like having other people knowing what I was doing and keeping me accountable for it and keeping me from getting tired was part of what I needed.
Should we keep going, or do you guys want to? Go ahead, Olivia.
I'm Olivia. I'm SHERP 28. What's the role of the science journalist in keeping scientists honest? And is there such is like investigative science reporting?
Sure.
And I feel like, Rebecca, you have experience with this, but it's more from a historical perspective. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on questioning science and scientists rather than
Oh yeah, I
lauding
think that's
them.
absolutely our job. I think one of the problems with some, especially daily science reporting, is people don't, there's obviously not the time, in some cases not the training, but science journalism can pretty easily become cheerleading. And I think that's something that all science journalists have to be very aware of. And that, I think part of our job is asking the questions that make scientists uncomfortable and that challenge what they're doing, but without being like, science is evil, I'm coming after you. Like certainly now, like when I call a scientist who's working on some project and if it has to do with consent or something, they get terrified when they hear that I'm calling. And, but if I didn't set out to write the story, I wasn't thinking like, I'm gonna uncover this really dark, dirty thing that these scientists are doing. I was just sort of asking the questions that came into my mind at the time. And I think the scientists appreciate it. None of the scientists in the book, none of the scientists who have, read any of this feel like they've been outed for something bad or that they were the subject of an investigation. They're all just like, this is what happened. Like, these are the facts, and like, you sort of present them. So, but I think asking the hard questions is definitely part of the job, and it's where the big stories come from. Like, a large part of the story is that Henrietta's kids were also used in research without their consent. It's like 2 generations, and most people, that's never part of the wasn't ever part of the story, and that just came from, asking some of these hard questions. So it actually opened up an entire part of the story that I wouldn't have known existed if I didn't say, can I see the consent form? Let's talk about how you explain this to them, and so that's where some of our stories come from. But
Mary, do you ever feel like you're essentially, checking the science or calling bullshit on people? I mean, your books are different in that way, but you end up doing some of that.
I think in obviously the book that was most appropriate to be doing that was Spook.
Yeah.
Where it was like, actually, like there was a guy at University of Arizona who was bringing mediums into the lab, and as it turned out, there was really basically no better than chance that they were able to, but he's like, but look at this one case, look at this one, but let's focus on that. I'm like, no, that's anecdote, let's not just focus on that. So, I mean, that's obviously the place where it came into play. For the most of the time, I'm doing more basic explaining and just talking about basic science then.
What do you think, Jen? Investigative, holding people accountable?
It does, yeah. I mean, it's if I could channel my co-host, I think what he would say here, which I think I mostly agree with. I mean, there is a small d democracy element to what we do. I mean, these scientists are people who, by their own education or inability to communicate, they seem to have some kind of knowledge that can feel off limits to the rest of us. And so there's a way in which when you poke at scientists, and it need not be a kind of, I just want the truth kind of poking. It could be more just, what do you mean? Really? How do you know that?
Right.
Wait, say that again? explain that one more time? You know, I mean, in broadcast, it's a little easier to do that because you can
Right.
include yourself in that exchange. There is a secret attitude that you're selling in that moment, which is that this is stuff that is available to all of us. And I deeply believe that scientists actually want to communicate their work. I find when I stick a mic at people, I mean, the classic experience that we have is that, you know, you get someone on the phone and they're fantastic. And then the moment you stick the mic in front of their face, it's like the mic is bringing in every colleague that could ever possibly hear the words they're speaking.
Well, it is.
So suddenly the room
Yeah.
is very crowded.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
it's like you feel like it's you standing there, but with everybody that could possibly hear it.
Yeah.
And so there is a way in which your presence can be an inhibitory thing. But I think mostly scientists want to communicate. Something got them into this. There was some
Yeah.
catalytic spark at the beginning that got them fired up about this
Right.
stuff. And somehow you have to get back to that version of those scientists.
Yeah.
But I mean,
And I
that's,
think
that's still putting them on a pedestal. I mean, like you inherently just trust them, and you trust that they're seeking the truth. But I mean, they're complicated people.
I
There
don't
are good
think
ones
there's
and
any.
bad ones.
There's never an inherent trust. I think that's actually you can never have an inherent trust for anyone that you interview. I think you have to have an inherent empathy, and an inherent curiosity, but never an inherent trust. I
Yeah.
think that's the thing you check at the door always.
Yeah, and I don't even know if, I mean, I think there is a place absolutely for investigative science reporting, and there's been some really important stuff done there, but I think that a lot of what we're talking about is just good reporting, like just asking the questions, and scientists, it's definitely doesn't have to be an interrogation, and it usually is. I mean, scientists are the ones who are usually really frustrated about that science cheerleading, because they do this study and they know this, you know, like, this doesn't mean red wine cures cancer, you know, or whatever, and they see these headlines as a result of their research, and they get incredibly frustrated. They don't want to talk to the press anymore. So you know, I think that this kind of goes back to where we started about the accuracy of how you present your information. I think that, you know, there are places for investigation, but I think a lot of what we're talking about is also just, you know, not being a cheerleader in terms of not trying to take a study and make it something it's not because you have a deadline and a headline to match, you know.
Right. John, is that you over there?
Yeah, hi, I'm
Yeah.
John Rennie.
Yeah. It's time to hear from one of-
I allegedly teach here.
time to hear from one of the great science editors.
No.
Go ahead,
Anyway, but as Dan did earlier, I'll apologize for asking sort of an awkward question of Jad, who can probably guess where this is going already. So maybe a month or two ago, Radio Lab wandered into controversy because it did a story that touched on yellow rain and the Hmong people and whether or not that they had been exposed to chemical weapons. Radio Lab got a lot of criticism after that, and one refrain that came back a lot out of that was a notion that, well, this is the problem. Radio Lab is fine when it does its sort of little gee whiz stories, but their whole approach with the banter and the wacky sound effects and everything else, this shows what happens when they try to do serious journalism, and they should avoid doing that. So I'm just curious whether you know, because you did get a lot of criticism for that,
Yeah, we
I'm
did.
curious whether you took some of that to heart and whether there were things that you thought Radio Lab would do differently in the future.
Well, that's. Let me sort of put that in context. You know, we started that story with a pretty, and maybe there's something interesting that I can cull from this that has to do with sort of science reporting in general. We started that story with a very narrow science question, which had to do with, was yellow rains a chemical weapon in the way that the government said it was in 1982? And throughout that process, you know, we talked to scientists, and we were sort of do what we normally do, which is to talk to scientists, kind of get both sides, construct a narrative out of that. Somewhere early on in that process, we decided, you know, in order to do a good job at this, we need to talk to people who were there, because it is an open question. I mean, it didn't seem to be an open shut case. So let's talk to people who were there and see what they say. Perhaps they can tell us something about this, the experience of this incident that could help us re-examine the science. In the course of that interview, there was some bad chemistry that happened, and we ended up having a very painful and uncomfortable conversation with a woman who essentially insisted that it was a chemical weapon, but that somehow our search for the answer to that question was deflecting attention away from the horror that she had experienced and her people had experienced. And that was a moment of reckoning for us,
So there was a real question for us, what do we do with that interview? Self-preservation would say don't air it, cut it out. You're only going to look bad. But for us, there was some interesting thing that happened in that we thought we were looking at one thing, but we realized that the scientific search we were on had deflected attention away from a much larger truth that was in some sense incompatible with the science. And so it left us in an interesting place. In some sense, a very comment on the whole endeavor of scientific journalism, which is that sometimes you're looking at things so myopically that you're somehow ignorant of the context of the basic emotional experience of being alive and what that means. And so we decided to have an open and honest conversation about how that interview went wrong, and how it is that you balance scientific accuracy with experiential truth when they don't seem to want to go together. Maybe we shouldn't have had that conversation. Maybe that was, by its very nature, insensitive. I don't know. But for me, there is something, I feel like the world is complicated. The world is not made up of binary realities where you have either a scientific truth or someone's experience. You can somehow hold them both at the same time. And that's what we tried to do. We tried to have that conversation. And it was a break in our form. It certainly was tonally very different than we usually do. But in some sense, I feel like to choose one version of reality in that moment would have been the biggest disservice of them all. We had to honor her emotional experience, and we had to honor the fact that the science was trying to tell us something. The two could not be, we can't give into either polarity in that case. And so that's what we tried to do. And I think what people heard was you had people hearing someone being very upset, and they forgot everything else. And perhaps that's a lesson for us. Were we to do that story again, we would lead our audience through it in a slightly different way, but we would damn well do that story again, no question.
I listened to that segment in preparation for our event tonight, and I thought it was great journalism. And I thought that where the error came was in Robert insufficiently acknowledging at the moment the broader context, which is that the Hmong people, their life was made a hell, and had been for multiple years, whether or not chemical weapons from Russia were sprayed on them or not. Those planes were bombing them and strafing them, and their lives were hell. So the broader point, which is this tension between the story that you're working on and the broader context of where it all fits in, that is just that shows up in story after story. I see it in my own work, about people who have been wronged by chemical pollution, and yet the limitations of science make causality very difficult to show. It's really tough to walk that line between what science can tell you and what it can't, and then the broader questions of the human experience. And I think that criticism was unjustified. I really do. I think that the problems were stylistic.
Yeah, I think there were errors of tone for sure.
Yeah. And
we would do the story differently for sure. But there's some way in which I stick by the intent.
Yeah. This is, I just want to add a little, this is something that I dealt with a lot in this book, because, one of the things that the Henrietta Lacks story has always been held up as within the Black community is another Tuskegee syphilis studies, like another example of Black people being used in research without consent, and this whole part of this very big, very painful, very real history. And the facts of the story is it really wasn't in that sense. In that same way. Tuskegee targeted Black men, hundreds of Black men. They picked them. They said, "You're Black. We're using you in research." They did really bad things to them. The scientists who were taking the cells from Henrietta didn't even know she was Black. They were taking cells from anybody. Race obviously played a big role in the story, in a lot of different ways, but part of my job was to tease that out and take something that was a really, really sensitive thing in the Black community and say, actually, it's not exactly another Tuskegee. But here's why here's what the Tuskegee syphilis studies was, and here's why the black community would absolutely rightly think that this was an example of Tuskegee. So it's like, and that's something that you end up doing a lot in science journalism when you start going into areas that are emotionally loaded. And sometimes you have to weed out the facts and what really happened and what the science is telling you versus what the public thinks happened and what the emotional impact of that was. And you have to be so incredibly aware of the scale and the scope of what you're dealing with. You have to, and my goal with that was to do as much as I could to understand why people believed this was an example of racist scientists doing, taking advantage of her because she was black. Like, to sort of try to understand why that fit in that history in order to then try and explain it in a sensitive way that gave, sort of paid homage to that and helped scientists understand why it is that the public thought that way, but then also kind of still laid out the facts. And that's, talk about a dance, it's a really challenging thing to do.
Yeah.
And it involved me also sending, again, the target readers. I had a lot of people who I knew would be very sensitive to that, who I said, okay, read this, let me have it. Like, what have I, did I do this, did I not? And, so I was so aware of the fact that I was tackling something that was within a larger context. And you guys, that story was much faster. I'd been working on this for so long that I was embedded in the story in a way that it made it, that was so large for me. And I think some of our challenges in those culturally important moments are realizing when we're entering into a cultural history that we don't necessarily know about because it's not ours, and we have to sort of become part of that in a way to report on it.
And not just the culture of the African American
Right.
community, but the culture of the people at Johns Hopkins and the people doing the work.
Right.
It just would have made no sense for someone
Right.
at that time to think, where did these cells come from? I mean,
Right.
it just
Yes,
wasn't
exactly.
in,
Right.
in the equation
Right.
at that time.
But I also think there's a way in which you have to be willing to be the idiot. I mean, in what we do, we are, in any cross-cultural dialogue, in any act of scientific translation, you have to be willing to be the idiot. Any act of translation is going to put you in that role. And you can't simply wait until you know in order to say, in order to speak. You have to somehow walk forward and lower your head and just go into it.
So the clock is ticking here. People are hungry, but we still have a lot of people who will ask questions. So let's have some fast questions and answers. We're going to go here, and then here, and then here.
Hi.
Hi, Rose.
I'm Rose.
What?
So,
Give your number.
Oh, I'm at 29. I had a question that somewhat relates to what you were just talking about, which is about finding voices and finding characters. And I mean, for Rebecca, it's like it was sort of built into the story that you had a family that you sort of worked with. But for Mary and Jad, like when you do a story and you need a voice, like how long does it take you to find the right person, and how many people do you go through? And do you know immediately that you've got the right voice, or does it take a little while to get them warmed up? And like, how does that process work?
Voice and character are tremendously important to me, but I often have no idea until I get there what I'm getting into or what this person will be like. I've had situations where I've gone somewhere and someone has been just unwilling to kind of bring it down to a human level or explain it in a way that even I could understand, and I've just cut my losses and quit. Other times I've shown up and somebody has just been so fascinating and so passionate and so eccentric or whatever it is, and I've just thank you, God. It's kind of hard. You can get a sense through email, through phone conversations. I'm a little bit different in that I'm not ready to roll until I have either an interesting character or something going on, just something that will bring it to life. There's not certain aspects, certain pieces of science that have to be in the book, so I'm very much driven by the narrative and the characters and the situations and scenarios. So, but it's largely intuitive, and you can absolutely miscall things and just, okay, that was a wasted 3 days.
I think it's intuitive, but also about following your gut when you're out on the road. And I heard Liz Gilbert talk about a story that she wrote like a long time ago about a search for the giant squid. And it was for GQ, and she was like, I'm going to go out on this boat. There's this guy who's been devoting his life to finding this squid. I'm going to go out there. It's going to be great. She got out like to this boat in the middle of whatever sea it was, and this guy was just a total dud. He was like, okie dokie smoky. Like he just he spoke in cliches. He had nothing. He wasn't a very good character, and she was in the middle of the ocean on a boat. And so she tells this great story of just, at first she's like, okay, well then the squid will be the main character, and the squid that nobody knows if it really exists. And so how am I gonna do that? And so then she just started talking to everybody, the cooks, the whoever, and it turned out, the guy driving the boat was just incredible. and this just very poetic in the way he talked about the squid, and so he became the voice of the story, really, even though in the end, like, he wasn't a source that was quoted directly. I mean, he was a character who appeared in the story, but that's where she found the voice for the story, and that's just her being an industrious reporter and being like, I'm on a boat, and I gotta write about a squid that maybe it doesn't exist, and what do I do? So I think just noticing when it's not working and not being afraid to just go, okay, scrap that plan, where am I gonna go, and what am I gonna do?
You definitely have to not fall in love with your reporting plan, because your plan will change.
And also, I think you go into a story sometimes with an expectation, like Spook. There was a chapter that had to do with soul weighing, because there was this guy, Duncan McDougall, who way back in 1910 or whatever it was, put people who were dying of tuberculosis on a scale to try to see if when they died, did the scale go down? Maybe there's a soul and it weighs 3/4 of an ounce, whatever. So, but there's some people, contemporary folks who were trying to do this with consciousness theory, and it's a long story. But anyway, there was this, and I had a sense of what this guy would be like. And I got there, and he was, in fact, just speaking on such a, quantum mechanics, consciousness, multisyllabic level that it was starting out to be a disaster. But in the end, our inability to connect and our attempts to understand each other ended up being what was interesting and funny about the piece. And because he was so, some people think of this as a micro abacus for on a cellular level, for, as I'm sure you know. He just, his language and my flailing around trying to understand him. And he had a habit of saying, he'd stop and go, okay, now tell me what I've been saying. I need to know you understand. So that dance between us became what was, I mean, it's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And I expected a 20-page email about everything I had wrong in the chapter. He actually liked the chapter as well. It was one of those wonderful, headed for disaster, but in fact worked out really well. So you just never know. There's usually a way to make it work, to see some aspect of it that is more interesting than you had thought in your stereotypical. And you start out from a point of ignorance. You don't really, what do I know about this? So you have to set those preconceptions at the door and go in and embrace whatever you got, unless it's so bad that.
Sometimes you gotta just.
Sometimes you gotta cut your losses.
You gotta go.
But it's funny. It's interesting. I mean, it's different. It's like a world of difference between writing and broadcast. I mean, I envy print reporters when it comes to character. You can lean back against the wall and really observe somebody, and cull a set of observations that create a really interesting character. In broadcast, you kind of have to invade their space and stick a mic uncomfortably close to their nose, and you have to somehow engage and just it becomes the threshold is different in some sense. You're looking for emotional heat. You're looking for somebody who can seduce you and make you fall in love, and become a vehicle for an idea in a way that feels completely authentic, but also kind of larger than themselves. So I feel like our character searches sometimes are hampered by the medium we work in a little bit.
So let's see, you don't have a mic back there yet, so let's go here and then we'll get you a mic and you can ask.
I'm actually a spouse as well of SHERP 14, Cheryl Harris. I had a question for you. When do you, when do you feel a sense, for everybody, sorry.
That's okay.
When do you feel a sense of obligation to engage in a form of civic journalism, especially when there is a massive effort funded by vested interests to roll back large bodies of well-established scientific fact, such as climate change? And I'm thinking about that in the context of the recent campaign and certainly the recent weather events. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly an element of my work, but it's. Anybody want to take that?
I mean, really an element of my work.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel an absolute. I think a lot of it depends on my sort of area of expertise and my. There are things that I absolutely feel like a duty to weigh in on, but I don't feel a duty to weigh in on that because that's not my area. I feel like there are other journalists who do that well and who should do that, and so I think and I think dangerous things can happen when people try to weigh in outside their area of expertise. I'm very much a biomedical, and ethics and that sort of thing. So yeah, like in that particular case, I'm not like, I gotta write an op-ed about climate change, because I think somebody else is probably a lot better suited to do that. But there are other things where absolutely I feel like I'm tired, I don't have time to write this right now, but I gotta do it because it's important. So I definitely have that.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone works in a political context, whether they acknowledge it explicitly or not. We all know what's happening in the world, and to some extent it informs our work. My work, it's a really big part of my work. But everyone has different ways of telling science stories. And I certainly think that one of the lessons of the recent election is that those who've just sort of thrown out their hands and said, well, the reality constrained world is doomed, that we're all just products of motivated reasoning and our own self-delusions, our own fantasies. Well, it's actually not quite that bad. And there is still a place for fact-based reportage on issues of controversy, including climate change, and it can have an impact, even if that impact is diffuse. So I'm happy that there's a lot of great work underway right now that does recognize the climate of denial and addresses it head on. You have a question way back there in the corner? I thought somebody had a question. Am I wrong? Okay, well, we have time for maybe one or two more. Does anybody want to give it a shot? Or are people hungry enough that we should just call it a day? I'm sorry, where?
Over here.
Oh, okay, Alex. Yeah. Rachel, can you get Alex mic? Thanks.
So one thing that I kind of struggle with is, I'm so into all the work that you all have done, but I wonder, and my kind of drive to come to SHERP was that I thought, well, there's the people like me who already kind of are driven and curious, but who I really want to reach are the people who, like you said, they entered high school biology, it was too abstract, too boring, and then they just wrote science off, Do you believe that people actually do have an innate curiosity, that they want to understand the world about them, and it's just the way you tell the story, or are there some people that we're never going to reach?
No, I think absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, I think I've personally spoken to like 2.2 million of those people at this point, or something. Like the number of people who, I go to these events, and I travel all over the country and speaking to the general public and scientists, and I do these events at universities. I'll show up at a campus, and they open it up to the general public, and without fail, every one of these events, the people comment on the fact that, like, we've never seen these people here before. You've got, the scientists who show up, and then, that's sort of understood, and then there's the readers who are interested in science, and then there's everybody else that they come out for this, and I hear over and over and over and over again from readers saying, I have no background in science. I mean, you hear this, I'm sure too. Like, this is, I am curious about how science works, but I just can never get it, and I always find it boring. And the comment that I get that I take to be like the biggest compliment to me is when I get people who say, like, I almost didn't read your book because it's like cells, and, but then I read it and it was interesting, and and I was so excited because now I understand what a cell is, and I can talk about DNA, and and they get so excited. And this is kids, grown-ups, across the board. Educated, not educated, it's absolutely universal. And I think that there is, and I think just the fact that this book has been on the bestseller list for 3 years, and it's absolutely not scientists or science-interested people who are driving that. It's everybody else. And I think that part of what and I had this battle with, the publishing industry for a long time, where they said people, they're not that into science. Like I have this stack of rejection letters that say things like, it's an interesting chapter in history, but it's never going to reach a really broad audience because people just aren't interested in this stuff. And I have one of those framed on my wall. And, and I think there's this a very inaccurate belief that people aren't interested in this. And I think all three of us are absolutely evidence that they most certainly are, if you can give it to them in a way that they can not just understand, but be engaged with on a just human level.
Absolutely. My own stepdaughters will not read science, have not read any of my books, but love Radiolab.
Oh, God.
Download every
Totally.
podcast. Love it. They were so excited when I.
The groupies.
Whoa, you
I
were
mean, the Jad groupies.
Like,
he
wait
gets
a minute,
mobbed.
wait a minute. I thought you didn't like science.
Right.
Jed, do you have a sense of your listeners?
them later.
Do you have a? I mean, does anybody ever, sort of, I don't know, try to figure out the demographics of the Radiolab audience? Like, who are they, and to what extent are they people who are not science people at all, but just love Radiolab?
Well, it's always it's a funny conversation to have from within public radio, where the median age is somewhere between 60 and 80.
Yeah. God bless them.
And so if our core listener, I mean, I don't actually know, to be honest, but my gut tells me there's somewhere between 20 and 30, which is like they're like infants in the public radio world.
Which is another reason why NPR is so excited about Radiolab.
Oh, yeah.
I don't suspect that they are hardcore science. I mean, I think they're a combination of just curious people, techies, and people who have kids and want to listen to the radio with their kids. I don't suspect that science is the commonality that binds them all, that glues them all to the radio. I think it's something just about basic curiosities,
And storytelling.
and storytelling, yeah.
And curiosity story, but there's also there's something that happens in the public when they get science and when they
Yeah.
and there's this sort of like, ha, we got it. Like people feel, and I see this with Radiolab. They've been doing this on the road, the show on the road, live Radiolab, and I went and saw them in Chicago, and they booked the biggest theater in Chicago, and it was packed, huge marquee, and there were screaming, giddy fans, and Jad and Robert are sort of out there being Jad and Robert, and and then at the end we go out the back door, we're gonna go somewhere, and we open the door, and it's like, hey, Jad and Robert, and these were not science people. These were most definitely there were quite a few giddy teenage girls. There were, and
were they throwing underwear or anything?
that's pretty good. Sometimes I think they probably do. But part of what happens, and I saw this, I was sitting out in the audience for this show, and very sort of anonymously just sort of sitting out there. And the one thing that I saw is everybody there is like we're geek cool, we get it. We are in this inside crowd that got this science stuff, and we think it's awesome. And there's something culturally that's really, especially for the younger crowd, that really does drive a sort of starstruck thing with the science that I think is really great.
Mythbusters, the huge phenomenal
Right.
success of Mythbusters.
Yeah.
Was,
Yeah. I also think there's a way in which, I think most of our audience, or much of it, or some of it, I'm not quite sure how much of it, doesn't think of us as a science show. And so there's a way in which the label gets in the way sometimes, I think. In terms of science journalists, what does that really mean at the end of the day?
Right.
Does that mean you're confined to look at some things and not others? That feels
Yeah, I don't
too
even.
limiting,
I don't even know if what I do should be called science writing. I write about topics that are related to science, but I don't really know what science writing means. Why is there a special category for science writing and not, I don't know, home economics writing? I don't know, or history. Well, there are. I guess history is a genre, but it's funny. I don't feel that comfortable with the label science writing, partly because I'm such an ill-educated goober. But it's interesting that, I think that the label, some people are, you're a science writer.
Well, for an ill-educated goober, you've done all right. You've done all right. So I think we should quit while we're ahead here. This was a great discussion. Thank you all very much for coming.